Hello and welcome to this short video about the autonomic nervous system. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and what I hope you're able to do by the end of this short video is just to be able to describe the basic structure and function of the autonomic nervous system. What we're going to do for a couple of slides before that is tell you why this is so important. What the autonomic nervous system does very basically is it maintains the internal environment of the body, and it does so by operating at a subconscious level. Basically, the autonomic nervous system is the means by which the nervous system exerts control over all of your internal organs, your heart, your kidneys, your liver, your eyes, and so on. The thing that is keeping your heart beating and your gut moving and all of the other functions that are essential for life is your autonomic nervous system. Because it controls the body's organs in this way, it is a really important drug target. I'll show you just a couple of examples, but there are very many which we don't have time to cover in this video, where we use drugs which are acting on, we think, peripheral organs, targeting disorders of the heart or the lungs and so on. But actually what they're operating on is the nervous system innervation of those organs. So they're exerting their control on the function of, say, the heart or the lungs by interfering with the nervous system control of the heart or the lungs. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system can be split up into three parts: the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and the enteric. The enteric nervous system is really the nervous system for the gut, and we're not going to talk about that in this video. We're just going to talk about sympathetic and parasympathetic. Very simply then, what these do is they control the function of the organs, and most organs are innervated by both the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. Now, I haven't shown you a picture of the autonomic nervous system yet because, to be honest, it's pretty ugly and a little bit intimidating, but we can't get through a video on it without showing you at least a basic diagram of what it looks like. So here we go. This then is from an old Gray's Anatomy textbook, and let me talk you through what's going on in this fairly intimidating picture. Here then we have the spinal cord from the bottom, the sacral, the lumbar, the thoracic, and the cranial segments, and then some regions of the brainstem, the medulla and the midbrain. You can see that from the spinal cord itself, in the middle sections, you have the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. These are colored red. You've got your first set of neurons leaving the spinal cord and then synapsing in this ganglia. There's a chain of these sympathetic chains, one either side of the spinal cord. And then from there, there's a second set of neurons that follow the course of some of these big nerves into then these organs, starting at the top of the body, the eyes and the organs of the head, all the way down to the organs at the bottom of the body. In blue then, from the lower sections of the spinal cord and these regions of the brainstem, we have the neurons of the parasympathetic system. These also synapse in these ganglia. These are the small circles shown down here. These are outside, though, of the sympathetic chain. And then from these ganglia, we have the second set of neurons again going on to the different organ systems. This is really as simple as a diagram of the autonomic nervous system could be, and it shows you as clearly as it can that most organ systems are innervated by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. The second really important feature then is both the sympathetic and parasympathetic have opposing effects. Whatever it is that the sympathetic system does to that organ system, the parasympathetic normally does the opposite. And it's a very common way of remembering what it is that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic do. Very simply, if you're trying to work out what is it that the sympathetic system is doing to a particular organ, think about what would happen to the function of that organ during a fight or flight response. For example, heart rate would go up, gut motility would change, and so on. The opposite then is the parasympathetic system. If you want a catch-all term for what the parasympathetic system does, think about what happens to the function of that system when we rest and digest. Our gut motility goes up, our heart rate goes down, for example. Now, these are very common. You'll see them in the textbooks all the time, but it's important to be clear that these simple definitions are extremes. Both systems are constantly active. There are very many situations which result in an increase, say, in heart rate. Many of them are due to the increase in the function of the sympathetic nervous system, but they're not all because of a fight or flight response, for example. To give you a bit more detail of these, then there's a couple of examples. We've got some structures. Let's give you one example to start with, which is the heart. When the sympathetic system is turned up, that generally results in an increase in heart rate and contractile force. When the parasympathetic system is turned up, that generally results in a decrease in heart rate and then a decrease in contractile force. When we look at a couple of regions of the GI tract, the small and large intestine, activation of the sympathetic system turns down gut motility, activation of the parasympathetic system turns it up, and in the case of the large intestine, increases the release of gut secretions to assist with digestion. This same basic structure, same basic pattern, sorry, is repeated for many different organs of the body. We're not going to go through them all. We'll leave this here just for a second for reference if you want to go through it, and it's covered in all the major textbooks. The key feature is that whatever you see on the left-hand side, an arrow going down from the sympathetic system, you normally see the arrow going in the opposite direction from the parasympathetic system. And when the arrow here is going up, the arrow here is going down. So opposing effects on different organs. Basically, one turns it up, one turns it down, or vice versa. All right, we're going to unpack the cell biology of the autonomic nervous system just a little bit more. I'm going to put a little bit more detail, if it's possible, onto that horrendous Gray's Anatomy diagram that we showed in a previous slide. I'm going to start by grossly simplifying it. So let's start then with a segment of the spinal cord, or in the case of the parasympathetic system, a region of the brainstem. The other key structural feature of the autonomic nervous system then is a ganglion. And what happens is we have neurons which leave the segment of the spinal cord and they synapse in these ganglia. Ganglia are simply just collections of neuronal cell bodies located outside of the spinal cord, at least in the case of the autonomic system. Then we have a second set of neurons that leave the ganglia and go on then to the effector organ, in this case the heart. We're showing here just 2 neurons, but obviously there are lots of neurons following this course for a particular spinal cord segment and a particular ganglion and a particular effector organ. Then we have the preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons. These are the 2 names given to the 2 sets of neurons, one leaving the spinal cord and going to the ganglia, the preganglionic, the second going from the ganglia onto the effector. These are postganglionic. The preganglionic neurons are myelinated, meaning they're covered in electrical insulation tape and their signal travels faster. The postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. So if we go back then to the diagram from Gray's Anatomy, let's add this detail back onto that diagram. So again, here we have the spinal cord running top to bottom with the brainstem on top. Here we have the chain of these ganglia called the sympathetic chain. There's one either side of the spinal cord, and you can see they are basically just chains of these ganglia, with the preganglionic neurons going into the chain, the postganglionic neurons then leaving. The ganglia for the parasympathetic system are not located in these chains, they're dotted throughout the body, but the same principle applies. There are some exceptions to these general principles. There are neurons that will go from the spinal cord through the sympathetic chains and then on to some ganglia located outside the sympathetic chains, even in the case of the sympathetic system. And there are some preganglionic neurons that will go into the chains and then go up a few segments and then come out. So it's not completely straightforward. And then we have the adrenal glands here, which are directly innervated by preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic system. And that's really because the adrenal gland, even though we think of it as a gland, is really just a collection of postganglionic neurons pumping out adrenaline into the system. Okay. Another key feature then, the reason why the autonomic nervous system is so important is because the neurotransmitter systems of the autonomic nervous systems are drug targets. And I said this at the beginning, and we're going to expand upon that in a little bit more detail now. The sympathetic system uses 2 different neurotransmitters. The preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine onto the postganglionic neurons, and they act on nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, so called because they were discovered using nicotine, or they were discovered as the receptor for nicotine. The postganglionic neurons then release noradrenaline onto the effector organ using adrenergic receptors located on the organ system. The parasympathetic system is a little bit more straightforward. Both the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, but onto 2 different receptor types. You've still got the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic system. And then on the effector organs, we have the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. Now, we talked in a previous video about how there are multiple different elements in the life and times of a neurotransmitter. We've got postsynaptic receptors, presynaptic receptors, we've got degrading enzymes, we've got neurotransmitter transporters, and we've got the enzymes that synthesize the neurotransmitter in the first place. And all of these can be drug targets where we have medicines which interact with that particular system. It can interact with and affect the biology of the whole neurotransmitter system. We're just going to talk briefly about noradrenaline as an example of this. We're going to talk about the receptors, and there are also drugs that affect agonists, antagonists, and degradation. Adrenergic receptors come in a couple of basic flavors. There are alpha adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic receptors, and each of those comes in multiple forms, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and so on. They're all metabotropic G protein linked receptors, which you'll remember from another video means they're not ion channels. They're coupled to intracellular signaling mechanisms. Their effects are a little bit slower, but are a little bit more complicated. They have a really good tissue-specific distribution, which makes them excellent pharmacological targets. What we mean by that is the particular organ, particular tissue will have alpha-1 receptors, and a different organ system will have alpha-2 receptors, and so on. It's not a complete discretion between the expression of different receptors and different organ systems, but it's good enough to make them really good pharmacological targets, because obviously if we've got a drug that targets only a specific type of receptor, then we've got a drug that's going to act on that particular component of the system only on that particular organ. A particular example I'm going to give are the beta adrenergic receptors. Obviously, because they're adrenergic receptors, they bind noradrenaline, so they're receptors for the sympathetic nervous system. There are three basic classes of beta receptors, beta 1 through beta 3. One specific example agonist of beta receptors is salbutamol. This is an agonist of beta 2 receptors, and it's an asthma treatment because obviously beta 2 receptors are then expressed on the lungs. Salbutamol is one of the most common and widely prescribed drugs in the world. It's transformed lives for many millions, if not billions, of people, and many of us use it every single day. It's a treatment for asthma, meaning it acts on the respiratory system, but actually, as I explained earlier, it's acting on the nervous system control of the respiratory system. An example of an antagonist, so essentially a drug which blocks beta adrenergic receptors, is propranolol. This is not specific for a particular class of beta receptors. I think it acts on beta 1 and beta 2, and it reduces heart rate and contractile force, resulting in a drop in blood pressure. Again, propranolol, one of the most widely prescribed, widely used, and one of the safest drugs in the world. There are many millions of people use it every single day. It acts on the heart, on the cardiovascular system, but really it acts on the nervous system control of the cardiovascular system. There are many, many other different medications which act upon different organ systems, but actually act on the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, innervation of those systems. Far too many for us to go through here, but any good pharmacology or neuroscience textbook will give you lots of different examples. All right, then a quick summary of everything we've covered in this video. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for the control of our organ systems by the nervous system, turning our heart rate up and down, making our lungs inflate and deflate, and so on. It does this mostly in an unconscious way. We don't decide that we want to increase our gut motility or our heart rate and contractile force. This happens unconsciously. Because it's responsible for nervous system control of organ systems, it's a really important drug target for disorders which affect the function of those organ systems. And many of the most common medicines in the world act upon the autonomic nervous system control of different organ systems. Okay, as always, the image credits, the images are used from an open access source, Wikimedia Commons. Any questions, please do just send me an email. My email address is there, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.